my gosh, this is it. Hello, I'm going live. So it's Christmas. I thought I'd read you some of my kids' favourite stories. They're much bigger now, but this is one of their favourite stories. It's called The Monster in the Loch, and it's by Hofer. So I'm going to read it to you. Okay. It's a Christmas story that I used to read to the children. It starts off, excuse my Scottish accent, Scottish people. I'm gonna go for it. In the north of Scotland, where the sea thrusts long arms into the land, lived old Ian MacDougall, the great laird. He lived in a castle perched so high on the top of the mountainside that the top was often hidden in the clouds. Like many Scots, he wore a kilt. His was of a yellow, blue, and green tartan which swished from side to side as he walked. He also wore a scarf so long that he had to wrap it 3 times round his neck to avoid tripping over it. There's his castle. Ian MacDougall had been a great laird and warrior in his youth, but that was a long time ago. Now his mighty sword lay in the cellar, so rusty, I'll show you a picture, so rusty that mice could safely use it as a slide. The once great laird lived alone, but for one companion, and that was no living friend, but the ghost of his great-grandfather. Would like to see a picture of him. There you go. Of course, the ghost was invisible. He did not play tricks or like making doors or stairs squeak. He did not wear a white sheet or rattle chains to frighten people or carry his head under his arm. But sometimes, to show he was still there, he would stand behind the curtains of the castle's great wall and make them sway gently. Then when Ian asked him a question, he would say, "Aye," by rippling the curtains from top to bottom, or "No," by making them move from side to side. Look, here he is, Ian MacDougall. Would you like to hear some music, grandfather? Ian would ask, and then the curtains would sway from side to side. And Ian knew that the answer was aye. And he would take up his harp and play to his invisible grandfather. And then his grandfather would be so happy that the curtains would start to billow and flap, and all the candles would blow out, and fairies and pixies would peer through the windows and laugh. And Ian MacDougall would laugh with them while the music played from his fingers. You're going to meet the monster. Ian MacDougall's castle overlooked the shores of the loch far below. The waters of the sea lochs in Scotland that cut into the very heart of the land are of a marvellous green colour. At the night, the moon's reflection shimmers in them, but the moon never shimmered in the loch below Ian's castle, for that was Loch Ness. You've heard of that, haven't you? The waters of Loch Ness were always darker than the night itself. Neither the moon nor the brightest stars were ever reflected in them, and the Loch Ness was the home of a terrible sea monster, a creature so huge that he could have swallowed whales like shrimps. Even the neck of this creature was as long as the loch shore, and he could stretch it into the depths of the nearby forest to catch any children foolish enough to wander there. There he is, with his long, scary neck and his head. There was a village below the castle too. When it rained, Im could see the grey slate roofs of the cottages shining, and in one of the cottages lived two children, a boy named Malcolm and his younger sister Heather, who was 6. Their mother had often said to them, "My children, you can go and play in the hills with the pixies or dance on the rocks with the fairies. You can chase the will-o'-the-wisps or tickle the trout in the burn. But one thing you must never do is to go into the forbidden forest by the side of the loneliness. For if you ever do, the monster will see you. And if the monster ever sees you, he will surely come and get you and eat you up." "Yes, mother," Malcolm and Heather always replied. We'd like to see some pixies and berries. They're picking blueberries. Didn't know blueberries grew in Scotland. Maybe there's some other kind of berry. Oh, here they are. You can see what happens. I'll read it first. It says, "But now the season of bilberries," they're bilberries, not blueberries, "and wild raspberries had come. Malcolm and Heather both loved these juicy berries, and they had often heard that the fruit which grew in the forbidden forest were the most delicious." Well, it's always like that, isn't it? So one day, at the end of August, Malcolm said to Heather, "If we go down to the forbidden forest, we could maybe find some bilberries or raspberries. We'd not need to stay for more than an hour." "I don't want to go there," said Heather. "Mother says it's not safe." "You're afraid like all girls," said Malcolm. "I am not," said Heather. "But it's silly to go there." "Do you not like bilberries?" asked Malcolm. "I like them fine, but—" "Come on then," said Malcolm. "Look, the heather's hidden in the mist. The monster won't see us." So off they went. There they are, eating bilberries and raspberries in the forest. What's going to happen? Can you guess? They found so many berries, so many juicy berries, that soon all of their fears of the forbidden forest were forgotten, and night fell so gradually that they never noticed its coming. It was then that the monster smelled the sweet smell of children, and looking for the source of the delicious, mouth-watering scent, he began to plough his way down the loch, rearing his neck up above the mighty pine forest. He saw the two children's heads in the clearing. Opening his enormous mouth, he gulped down the two children in an instant, and he was so hungry that the monster didn't bother to chew. So they just slid down his throat like a giant helter-skelter into his stomach. Then he slithered back into the water and dived deep down into his home at the bottom of the loch. There he goes. Well, it can't end there, can it? Surely not. No. Meanwhile, the children's mother had been waiting and waiting for them to come home. Hours passed and there was no sign of them. At last, beside herself with worry, she went out and began to ask the neighbours if any of them had seen her children. "No, we've not seen either of them." And then she asked the fairies and the pixies and the will-o'-the-wisps if they had seen Malcolm and Heather, but they all said that they had not. At last, one fairy remembered that she had seen two little heads leaning over a clump of bilberries near the loch. The people of the village realised, Heather and Malcolm. They must have gone to the Forbidden Forest. Oh, no. When they had all gathered in the village square, the villagers tried to think of what they could do next. Should they go and attack the monster? Impossible. We've not got any weapons. Then Heather and Malcolm's mother, who was at her wit's end, turned to the others and said, I have an idea. Let us see the great laird. He alone can help us. He must have a sword somewhere in that castle of his. All the men and the women of the village made their way up to the tall castle where Ian MacDougall lived. That evening, Ian was sitting lonely and sad by his fireplace. He felt that nobody needed him, and the curtains, which his grandfather Ghost had so often moved, were still. Suddenly, there came a knock at the door. That wasn't very loud, was it? Because I just bashed my knuckles on my phone. Anyhow, a knock at the door. He got up, delighted to have a visitor. In front of him, though, stood the chief man of the village, with all of the rest of the men and women of the village pressing in behind him. What has happened? Asked the great laird. Two of the children of the village strayed into the Forbidden Forest tonight, the chief man said. The monster is holding them prisoner, or he may even have eaten them. We do not know. Help us. We have no weapons. Help us free these children if they're alive. If they're not, help us avenge their deaths. There they are. Look. Going up to the castle up on the... There he is, listening to his grandfather Ghost. You can see the ghost up in there. They're speaking to him. And little fireflies. I love this story. And off he goes with the harp and the fireflies and the fairies and the pixies, and even an owl is going with him to play the harp for the monster. Ian MacDougall followed the fairies, the pixies, and the will-o'-the-wisps with a golden eye, and with a golden-eyed owl perched on his shoulder, and strode down to the loch's dark black waters. And there, in the sinister empty place, he played and played his harp, and suddenly the waters started to move, and two silver salmon leapt from the waves as the enormous, terrifying head of the monster broke the surface. It was only a few feet away from Ian, and he could feel the warmth of the monster's breath on his face and cheeks. But the monster was the monster going to open his mouth and swallow him? Harp, owl, pixies and fairies and everything? Fearful but determined, Ian played on. Then slowly the monster's great neck began to sway gently from side to side in time to the music. Gradually, gently, as he moved, he finally took one step towards the beach and lay down on the shore, and in a moment the monster was fast asleep. Ian knew he had won. Music, which was mightier than the sword, had cast a spell on the monster. There he goes, playing his harp. Pixies are listening. Oh, I can't show you that picture because you'll know the end. I'll just read it to you. Ian stopped playing. It was then that he heard the strange noise coming from the monster's stomach. It sounded as though two marbles were rolling around underneath the animal's thick scales. But Malcolm and Heather were not dead. They were alive and well in the warmth of the monster's stomach and searching for a way to get out. Climb up through his neck, shouted Ian. His mouth is now open so you can get out. And that is how the children escaped. They had been very frightened but they were grateful to the neighbours of the village, and especially to Malcolm. Ian McDougall, not Malcolm. Malcolm's the boy. Ian McDougall for freeing them. As for the monster, he was helpless and lying fast asleep because of the music. No one wanted to kill him. Everyone realised that he, being charmed by Ian's music, had become kind and gentle. Look, they're climbing out. Don't they look happy to be free? Here you go, it's a nice picture. Each Saturday since that famous night, the monster has taken the village children for rides on the loch. The waters of Loch Ness have become clear and transparent, so that at night they reflect the light of the moon and the stars rippling silvery splendour. The fishermen who live round Loch Ness are no longer afraid to cast their nets in its waters because the monster has become their friend. Often in the evenings, when all the children have gone home to bed, the monster lays his great neck along the margins of the shore. Then Ian McDougall sits close by his head and plays his harp very softly, so softly that only the monster and perhaps Ian's grandfather can hear it, and the stars and the moon seem to dance to its music on the enchanted waters of Loch Ness. Did you like that? I hope so. I'm going to read some more stories that my kids used to listen to when they were little. You have an amazing Christmas.